It was the kind of afternoon where the world felt slow sun drifting in lazy arcs, cicadas buzzing in the trees, and the soft clink of ice against glass as I settled into my porch chair with a book. That's when I heard the crunch of tires on our gravel driveway, followed by the heavy slam of 3-car doors. The voices came next sharp, authoritative, dripping with the kind of fake confidence you only hear from people who've never actually been in charge of anything real. I looked up to see her, the notorious self-appointed HOA president, who had been sniffing around the neighborhood for months. Even though our block wasn't part of any HOA Karen, she stood at the end of my walkway like she owned the place, her rounded figure wrapped in a pastel pantsuit that looked like it had been pulled straight from a thrift store power fantasy, lips curled into a smirk that made my skin crawl. Flanking her were 2 men in cheap, mismatched security uniforms, black polo shirts with a generic private security patch slapped on the sleeves. Both had the kind of posture that screamed they'd been practicing intimidating stances in front of a mirror. "You're in violation," Karen announced, skipping pleasantries. "You've been warned about sitting on this porch without HOA approval. We're here to remove you." She said it like she was delivering a court order instead of a laughable piece of fiction. My first instinct was to laugh, then to be angry. "We're not in an HOA Karen," I replied, standing. "And you're trespassing." She didn't flinch. She waved a clipboard at me, some printed bylaws with our address scrawled at the top in blue pen. "According to Section 5 of the Community Code, that you made up," I interrupted, my voice climbing. One of her rent-a-guards took a step forward like he thought this was going to be easy. What Karen didn't know, what made this entire situation a ticking time bomb, was that my dad, a retired SWAT commander with 30 years of real law enforcement under his belt, was inside. He'd been in the kitchen, fixing himself a sandwich, when he heard Karen's opening salvo. By the time one of the guards took another step onto the porch, Dad was already at the door. When he came out, it was like the air changed. He wasn't in uniform anymore, but he didn't have to be. His stance alone was enough to make people reconsider life choices. "Can I help you folks?" he asked, calm, almost pleasant, though I could see the steel in his eyes. Karen turned, sizing him up, but her smirk didn't fade. "Yes," she said. "You can tell your daughter, tenant, to vacate this porch immediately. She's in violation, and my security team is here to enforce removal." Dad's smile was the kind that always came before bad news for the other person. "And who exactly are you?" he asked. Karen bristled. "I'm the HOA president for this neighborhood." Dad glanced at me, then back at her. "Funny. I've lived here for 10 years, and we've never had an HOA. Do you have legal documents? A court order? Police backup?" She lifted her chin. "I don't need the police. I have my own security." That was her first mistake. Dad took a slow step down the porch stairs until he was eye to eye with her 2 guards. "Private security has no legal authority to remove a lawful resident from their property," he said evenly. "You step onto my porch, and you're committing trespass. You put your hands on my kid, and you're committing assault. And I guarantee you won't like how that ends." Karen tried to rally. "You think you can intimidate us? We're here under authority granted by..." "Granted by who?" Dad cut in, his voice dropping low. "A piece of paper you typed up in your living room? You're about 30 seconds from having to explain this to the real police. And when they get here, they'll run your names and find out just how much trouble you're in." One of the guards glanced at the other. I caught the flicker of doubt in their eyes. And that's when Dad did something I didn't expect. He pulled out his phone, tapped a contact, and put it on speaker. "Hey, this is Commander Thorne, retired," he said. "Got a couple individuals impersonating HOA officials and private security at my address. Yeah. Trespassing. Attempted removal of a lawful resident. You might want to roll a couple units." Karen's smirk cracked just enough to show the panic underneath. But she wasn't done. "This is harassment," she snapped. "You're threatening my team." Dad didn't even blink. "No, ma'am. This is me telling you the law. The threat comes when the squad cars show up and the DA hears you tried to forcibly remove someone from private property." That's when the twist hit, because just as Karen opened her mouth to retort, A voice called from across the street. It was Mr. Delgado, the quiet older gentleman who kept to himself. He was standing at his fence with his phone held high, recording everything. "I've been waiting for you to try this here," he shouted. "Got you on video doing the same thing to the Martins last week." He waved toward the corner where the Martins' house Saturday. "You remember that, right? When you shoved Mrs. Martin off her own steps." Karen's face drained of color. The guards froze. Dad turned slightly, catching my eye with a look that said, "We've got her now." The sound of distant sirens carried across the neighborhood, low but getting closer. Karen's bluster faltered, and her hands tightened on that clipboard. The guards shifted their weight like they were already halfway to bolting. I could feel the tide turning. The sirens grew louder, their wail curling through the warm air like a promise. Karen glanced over her shoulder, her eyes darting between the street and her so-called security detail. She tried to pull herself back together, straightening her shoulders, but the mask was slipping fast. Dad didn't move from his spot at the base of the porch steps, a wall between her and me. His voice, calm but cutting, carried enough authority to keep her frozen in place without him ever raising his volume. When the first cruiser pulled into the driveway, Karen's smirk came back like a reflex, though it twitched at the edges. "Finally," she said, loud enough for the officers to hear as they stepped out. "I'd like to report a trespasser and harassment from these individuals." She pointed directly at my dad and me. The two officers exchanged a quick look, then their eyes landed on him. Recognition flashed. "Commander Thorne?" one of them asked. "Didn't expect to see you here." Karen blinked, clearly not anticipating that the police would know exactly who my father was. "Yes," he replied. "And I'm calling this in as a criminal trespass, attempted unlawful eviction, and possible assault, depending on what we find in Mr. Delgado's video." He gestured toward the neighbor across the street, who was still filming, his camera catching every word. Karen's voice cracked as she tried to interrupt. "They're lying. This is an HOA enforcement matter." The younger officer raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, there's no registered HOA for this neighborhood." The older officer added, "And even if there was, private security can't physically remove someone from their property without a lawful court order." He turned to the two men in the black polos. "Do either of you have a current security license?" The guards shifted uncomfortably. One mumbled, "Not on me," while the other just stared at the ground. The officers had them both step to the side, away from Karen. She tried to follow, but the older officer held up a hand. "You stay right there." Then came the unraveling. Delgado crossed the street, phone in hand, and without a word handed it to the younger officer. The video played loud enough for all of us to hear. Karen, just a week earlier, storming up the Martins' porch, her security, shoving Mrs. Martin backward when she tried to block them. Karen's voice on the recording was unmistakable. "Remove her. She's in violation." The camera caught the look of fear on Mrs. Martin's face and the sneer on Karen's. The older officer's jaw tightened. "That's enough for assault," he said flatly. "And if you've been doing this around the neighborhood, we'll be talking about a lot more than that." Karen's voice pitched high, shrill, desperate now. "That video is fake. This is all fake. These people are conspiring against me because I enforce rules. That don't exist," Dad cut in. "Rules you made up. Authority you don't have." He folded his arms, his body language steady as granite. "And you came to my house to play out your little fantasy with my daughter as your prop. That ends now." The officers put her in cuffs right there at the bottom of the porch. She screamed about lawsuits, about corruption, about knowing people in high places. But every word just made her look smaller. The guards were patted down, their IDs run, and both were found to have prior records, one for impersonating security, the other for petty theft. Neither said a word as they were led to separate cruisers. Within days, the fallout began. The footage from Delgado and the body cam recordings from the officers made the evening news. The headline read, "Fake HOA president, arrested for assault, trespassing, and impersonation." The segment ran side-by-side clips of Karen's attempted removal of me from my porch and her attack on the Martins. Neighbors who had stayed quiet started speaking up. Calls poured into the police tip line from 3 other neighborhoods describing similar incidents. When the district attorney laid out the charges, the list was longer than anyone expected. Multiple counts of assault, criminal trespass, attempted unlawful eviction, conspiracy, and impersonation of an officer. The guards were charged as co-conspirators. The DA even tacked on harassment charges for the threatening letters she'd left in people's mailboxes, warning them of enforcement actions if they didn't comply. Her trial was a spectacle. Every day, the courthouse steps were crowded with residents holding handmade signs. No HOA here, stop the scam, and my personal favorite, porch rights are human rights. Delgado testified. Mrs. Martin testified. Even the guards, desperate to shave time off their sentences, took the stand to describe how Karen had recruited them from a Craigslist ad, paid cash, and told them they'd be helping to restore order to rogue neighborhoods. The jury didn't take long. Guilty on every count. Karen was sentenced to 3 years in county jail and ordered to pay restitution to every household she'd targeted money she didn't have. Her pastel pantsuits became county-issued orange overnight. But the true poetic justice came a month later, when the city council, under pressure from a newly emboldened group of residents, passed what they called the Porch Protection Ordinance. It banned any non-law enforcement entity from attempting to remove someone from their private property without a court order and imposed steep fines for impersonating HOA authority. The law bore my dad's name as its informal nickname, Thorne's Law. Life in our neighborhood shifted after that. People stopped glancing away when something seemed off. We exchanged numbers, set up a neighborhood watch that wasn't about control but about safety, and made sure no one would ever be blindsided by fake enforcers again. On a quiet afternoon not long after, I asked Dad if he'd been tempted to go further that day to really confront Karen with the full SWAT energy I knew he could summon. He chuckled. "The trick isn't about force," he said. "It's about letting people write their own ending while you make sure the camera's rolling." And he was right. The moment Karen stepped onto my porch with her clipboard and her fake security, she'd already started writing the last chapter of her own story. All we had to do was let the truth finish it for her. So now I wonder, was what we did that day an overreaction? Or the only kind of reaction that keeps a bully from coming back? I know my answer. What's yours?